They erased the night. They erased the paper trail. They left us with our memories and a silence that follows like shadow. I know how that sounds. Crazy, melodramatic. I'm 80 now, and the years strip the edges off memory until only the hard bones remain. What I remember from that night in late 1987 is not poetry. It's smell and cold and the sound of men who stopped breathing. We were a routine night patrol, nothing more ambitious than a route check along a county line, a sweep near an old logging road and the mouth of a disused mine, the kind of place locals call a holler. 8 of us went out. Sergeant Hale led the patrol. He'd been around longer than most of us had been alive. His hands were the sort that told you where to put yours when a situation tightened. Corporal Diaz watched our left flank. Jenkins ran the radio. He was the kid who'd volunteered for night shifts just to get out of barracks boredom. 2 privates on point, a medic who'd patch you if you scraped a knee and stayed to patch your head if the trouble got larger, and me, a young PFC with more curiosity than caution. We weren't looking for trouble. We weren't on anything secret. The orders were simple. Confirm the condition of a sector that had been reported for deer poachers and illegal dumping. Check that the old mining road was clear. Make sure hikers hadn't wandered into dangerous shafts. There had been talk in the mess hall about the holler, the kind of talk that gets laughed off, old wives' tales, moonshine fiction. Folks in that part of the mountains said you don't go into the holler after dark. Keep to the ridgeline, an old man at the convenience store told Hale the week before. You don't stay, you don't sleep there. Hale nodded and paid the old man for his time with a polite smile. We laughed about it later over coffee. We were soldiers. Warnings like that are part of the scenery. The road was a narrow scar of gravel and mud that hooked into the bones of the mountain. The trees leaned in close, and the mist sat low and stubborn, thick enough that the jeep's low beams cut anemic lanes through it. October was already hard on the leaves. They clung in muted reds and browns, dead hands clapping closed behind our shoulders. The temperature dropped as the climb tightened, the breath in my lungs a small white thing that fogged and vanished. If there's one thing that settles a man into his skin, it's being forced to hear the world again. On that road, the world had been quiet in a way I didn't know a forest could be quiet. Not just the usual night quiet, no frogs, no distant stream, no high insect hum that usually stitches the dark together. It was a kind of attentive silence, like a crowd holding breath for something about to begin. We joked to cut the tension, small cheap jokes about being haunted, privacy of routine. The mist swallowed the punchlines.
We stopped at the old marker where County Road 17 narrows toward the mine entrance. Hale lifted a hand. The radio in Jenkins' pack coughed alive with static and the cackled voice of the bass, distant, indifferent. "Echo check," he said softly. No answer, besides the static. He pressed the mic, eyes narrowing into a slit against the mist. We were supposed to be within range, but the hollow had a way of swallowing signals. That little hiccup should have been a warning on its own. Instead, we shrugged and moved out on foot, flashlights off so we wouldn't betray the patrol's approach. That's when we saw the tracks. They lay along the side of the logging road in a staggered line, 4 or 5 prints at first, spaced wrong for a human stride, too deep in the soft ground, as if something heavy bent the earth when it moved. The prints were long, wider than my boot, clawed at the edges, and they ran up the incline and vanished into the dark between 2 trunks. A scent came with them, a hot, rotten smell like a grave unsealed under damp leaves and old sap. The medic, Lynch, put a gloved hand near the first print and didn't touch. "Not bear," he said, though he knew as well as I did that in that mountain hollow you learn the shapes of animal tracks before you learned your alphabet. Bears make a certain punctuation. This was not punctuation. It was a sentence written in a language I didn't know. Hale crouched, palms on his knees, eyes the sort that catalogued and filed. He traced the outside of the print with his fingertip, careful, as if the thing might bleed at the edges. "Too high," he said finally. He looked up at the trunks, then higher, and pointed where the bark had been shredded in long gouges at a place 6-8 feet above the ground. The marks were ragged and deliberate, a rake of scar down to sapwood. Whoever, whatever, had left them didn't use hands the way we do. The gouges suggested something that could reach above a man without effort. Corporal Diaz swallowed. "Tree scrapes? That high?" "It isn't up to us to judge height," Jenkins said, voice small through the fog. He sounded like a child who'd lost his parents in a grocery store. No one suggested turning back. Not then. The patrol edged forward, boots crunching on the wet leaves, breath folded into the mist. We found a pack, slung over a low branch like a grotesque satchel. worn straps, a canvas that had been stripped and teared. Something had taken the seam and torn the lining out like a hand pulling the meat from a bone. The pouch hung heavy with things that had been strewn but not fully emptied, a busted flashlight, a thermos cracked and black with rot. The smell rolled off it, stronger now, like the wall of a closed room opening. "Local grill," Hale said quietly. "Hunter's pack, maybe." "Maybe," someone echoed. We left a mark, a piece of blue cloth we tore from a sleeve, folded it into a knot, and left it on a branch where the pack had hung.
Standard protocol: leave evidence in place, call it in. Hale made shorthand notes in the little pocket log everyone carries on patrols: time, location, and observation. We set a perimeter and lit no fires. Lantern light eats wood and draws eyes. We kept it cold, clinical, then moved on to check the mine opening. The mine mouth was half collapsed, a black gullet hemming the road. The timbers that remained sagged like the crooked teeth of an old man. We peered, but didn't go in. There was a rope tied off to a bolt, new as if recently used. Small bones, deer maybe, lay scattered near the mouth, picked clean in a way that made the hair rise on my arms. The quiet was absolute. Even temperature seemed suspended. Everything pointed at presence. I saw then words scratched into the outer rock near the entrance, shallow and jagged, letters that might have read like a warning if one had ever seen that alphabet before. They were not words we could read, unintelligible scratches. Hale wiped one with his glove and frowned. "Someone's been here before last week," he told us, but his voice had a different shape, like the edge of a lid being lifted. We radioed base to log our finds. The transmission came back clipped, bureaucratic. "Copy. Log items. Return to base when complete." Jenkins' reply was short, professional, but the signal wavered, then dropped into static. The hollow ate voices like it ate insects. Jenkins cursed under his breath and restarted the set. When the connection returned, the man on the other end sounded annoyed, like he thought we were wasting time. We logged on paper, attached a sketch, and folded it into the file. That was the moment I thought everything would be the same as any other patrol. That was the moment I was wrong. There had been rumors about that stretch of hollow long before our orders. In the diner a week earlier, a woman with hands like gnarled roots had watched us suit up and said with an old woman's certainty, "You shouldn't go down that way. They don't leave them be." She didn't mean animals or moonshiners. She meant something else. Hale paid her with a cigarette and a hard nod. He didn't lubricate the conversation with the kind of dismissive laughter the rest of us had. There was something in the way he listened, like a map maker learning when a coastline is changed. If you spend your life moving across other people's maps, you learn to keep a mental tally of local council. The holler had its old council. It had its boundaries marked by things you could see. A line of older trees growing strangely straight. A scatter of stones where no one would place them, and people who refused to go there after dusk. They told us about a thing they'd call different names. A night rag. A hollow man. Something with no single name, because the mountain keeps its own vocabulary. We laughed, yes. When adults tell children stories about monsters, you chuckle, because you don't want to leave room for the possibility you've been wrong all along. But the laughter thins when you're standing where the laughter comes from. That's when the stories stop being jokes and start to sound like cautionary talismans. "This is the place," Lynch muttered, drawing an exhale that clouded the air between us. "Jenkins, get this on record. We found prints, high gouges, pack hanging." Jenkins did as he was told. His fingers moved like the practiced hands of a radio operator on a drill. He spoke plainly, calmly, until even his voice couldn't hold the shape of ordinary things. Over my shoulder, the trees closed like curtains. The mist grew thicker, iron in my nostrils. The forest seemed to have a weight pressing inward, as if something heavy had settled in the valley and refused to rise. "Look," Diaz said, and this time his tone had the brittle edge of someone straining to be brave for the group. He pointed to the base of a tree where the ground had been disturbed, as if something had been dragged. A strip of fabric, like the cuff of a shirt, trailed into the underbrush. The end of the trail disappeared where the dead leaves had been lifted and then smoothed, as if a hand had run through them. We debated there, the way soldiers debate. Pros and cons reduced to tactical decisions, the usual logic of safety versus mission. "We report and wait for backup," one of the privates said. "We secure the area and call it in," Hale replied. He did not elect to move further into the mine. He elected to circle, to secure, to look for sign, and to make a record. That's the thing about men like Hale. They don't want to look brave. They want the shape of the right thing. We walked the perimeter. The tracks repeated, and the spacing grew more uneven. Sometimes the prints were solitary, as if the thing had stopped to test the air. Sometimes they came in a grouping that suggested a pause near something. That pack, maybe, or a body. Once we found stray hair, coarse and pale, snagged on bark. Once we found a smear of something dark on a rock that had the tack of old blood, but smelled of rot and iron in a way that made my stomach turn. Could be coyotes, someone offered, and we each let that lie on the air like a coin, wanting it to buy us safety. We weren't far from the ridgeline where the road leveled into a shallow bench. The moon, when it came, was a thin rind behind cloud, the kind of night where the dark isn't so much absence as a presence that occupies real space. It presses against your face, it has taste. A bat or two cut close to our heads, and then the bats stopped too, as if something made them change their route. I remember the silence because it's rare to hear silence in such a way that it feels deliberate. The wind dropped. Even the leaves seemed to hold their breath.
The only sound was the little mechanical whisper of our radios and the wet, soft crunch of our boots. Then, without any other fanfare, an animal cry ripped the hollow in twang. Not like a deer or a dog, something higher and tighter and almost human keening, then a wet thud the next instant. The sound ricocheted off the rock walls and died. "Contact?" someone whispered. "Unknown," Hale said. He made the sign for caution and nodded. We spread out instinctively, voices hushed, eyes trying to find a shape in the fog. The flashlight beams stretched like fingers searching for a match. It happened too fast and too slow all at once. The first time you see something that doesn't belong to any of the natural categories, you have to reorient the world in your head. Does this belong to the category of animal, man, rock? It didn't fit. At first I thought it was a man, all pale and wrong. Then I knew it wasn't a man by the way it moved. Taller than a man, joints, angles too long, shoulders slouching in a way no trained soldier slouches. It moved with a surprising hush, like a shadow that learned to walk. It stepped from behind a tangle of rhododendron, and for a breathless fraction of a second the moon found it. For a moment I could see pale skin, maybe fur, maybe something in between. Its head was longish, not quite a human skull. Eyes, they were not reflective the way animal eyes are. They were empty, kind of dark and too alert. It tilted its head, considering us as a man might a puzzle. The first thing that hit us wasn't the creature itself, but the smell. It flooded the air, sour and deep, like rot baked in summer. Jenkins gagged and turned away, hand going for his mouth. I felt the old reflex of a rifle in my hands, the same reflex that under ordinary conditions makes a man find his function. We fired. The sound happened, but it wasn't a crescendo of triumph. The bullets punched into the creature's shoulder and it barely flinched. It let out a sound then, low and curious, almost like a chuckle, and with a motion that was breathtakingly fast, it lashed out. I saw bodies thrown like rag dolls. Private Collins went up, his lamp scattering stars and leaves, and crashed into a hollow like a log flung from a mountain. He didn't move after that. The world narrowed to the immediate need to survive. Hale shouted orders the way he always had. Anchor, return, withdraw. But even as he barked, the creature demonstrated something that would have been almost comic if the stakes hadn't been oil-black real. It wasn't a mindless eater. It reached in a way that suggested testing for tools, for nets. It seemed to understand that we were dangerous because of the metal and the noise we made. It looked at our weapons, then at our hands, and made the choice of attack like a man choosing which door to break down. It was organized not in the way soldiers are organized, but in the way a cunning animal shapes its hunt. We tried to regroup.
2 men tried to help Collins and were struck. Jenkins' radio fell silent between a call for medevac and a scream that choked out into the static. The creature moved with an economy of motion, quick like a trained hunter, not random but precise. It struck where the body is soft. It never lingered. It took. We saw limbs move without consent, and then stillness. Lynch tried to crawl. He didn't get far. My rifle went empty and I didn't reload fast enough. I remember thinking, absurdly, about instructions for cleaning weapons. Memory is a strange animal in an acute moment. It gives nonsensical gifts. I remember the taste of fear like metal. Hale was beside me, pulling me to the jeep with a hand like a vice. "Run," he shouted, and we did. There was a line of road and the jeep was idling with its engine quiet like a sleeping beast. We flung ourselves into it, the number of us crammed like a comic strip, the wheel spinning up with half a man hanging out the side. The mountain answered us with a chorus of other sounds, branches snapping, the heavy thud of something hitting dirt, someone screaming until they cannot breathe for force of terror. We got away. We tore down the gravel with tires screaming, leaving men behind who had been friends and targets and bodies and names I still say at night. 2 of us jammed our hands to our faces and wept for the first quarter mile, because there is a biochemical surrender that happens when a human understands he is a bone among many.
It was only afterward, weeks, months later, that I cataloged precisely who was there, who survived, who didn't. In that first hour, there was confusion and rage and a hollowing panic. I remember Hale's face in the passenger seat, white as paper, and the silent vow we all made that we would get back for our own. I remember flame in my chest, that rawness of wanting to make it right. We radioed the base, breathless and crying and the words spilling over each other. We told them we'd been attacked. We told them we'd lost men. The line responded at the first call as if with skepticism, and then with a socket of practicality. The voice on the other end said, "Maintain position and await assistance." But the words had a tautness, an inflection like someone trying not to laugh at a child's tall tale. "Do you have visual confirmation of enemy activity?" the man asked. We gave them what we had, the site, the tracks, the pack, the scars on the trees. Hale tried to make it efficient and bureaucratic because that's what he had left to him, procedure. When the response came, it felt like a bruise. Copy, document, report as a possible encounter with local wildlife or illegal activity, file an incident report, forward any physical evidence to base. The wording mattered, the categories mattered. We were asking for recognition that what we had faced was beyond the boxes they'd kept on the forms. They didn't have a box for it. They made a box for wildlife encounter and shoved us in.
We were taken off mission order, and an ambulance came for the wounded. The drive back was a corridor of oval lights and radio squawk. Hale refused to let us talk about what had happened beyond the necessary facts for the medics and the NCOs who rolled us back into base. He had been a leader in his bones long before he ever answered an assignment. He cared for the living before he let us honor the dead. In the wake of it, things began to thin the edges of reality. Words were written in the log, and then later weren't. A bag of evidence logged in the locker was gone by morning. Jenkins' radio call had been recorded by the net, but the file had a gap, 27 seconds of static where an entire life had been compressed into a scream. Someone told us later that the base had classified the event as mishandled wildlife contact. They said it in neutral tones in the administration office, like a man reading the weather, and I felt like I'd been spat at. I argued. So did Hale. We demanded to know what had happened. We wanted to understand if what took our men was an animal or a human or some other thing. We wanted to know how the paperwork could be different from the way the flesh had felt beneath our hands. They said, "The report as filed has been closed with no further action required." That's the bureaucratic way of saying the world didn't have to dirty itself with answers. They asked us to keep quiet. The question of why they asked is still one I lay awake over. They didn't threaten by name. Threats in that language are oblique. They asked for discretion for operational integrity. They suggested in no uncertain terms that a story like ours could cause panic in local communities and alter the people's trust in the base. "We'll handle the local side," an officer told us, with a bland expression I can't forget. We were told to be careful in our language with outsiders. We were told to let it go. The thing is, men who have lost other men don't easily let go. Real grief doesn't obey polite requests. Back at the Hollow, the county sheriff came up with 2 deputies and one of the old women from the diner. That woman with the bony hands had driven herself up in a truck with a blanket and watched us from the periphery. She refused to go near the place at night. She sniffed the air as if distrustful. She nodded at Hale, then to us, and for the first time I saw a sorrow that matched ours. They took photographs. They cataloged tracks and took soil samples. The sheriff's deputy told us in private that he had received 3 missing person reports in the last 2 months from folks who had been on those roads and not returned on time. Missing hunters, a teenager who'd gone off to find a legend, an elderly man who liked to walk his dog. "People drift off up there," he said with a tone that suggested he didn't want to believe the alternative. He made a file. He made copies. He promised to pass them on. He clasped his hands as if that would stitch the world back together. We waited for something more concrete. We expected, perhaps foolishly, that once civilian authorities took interest, the pattern would make itself plain. That didn't happen. The sheriff's copies were never returned to us with their conclusions. The base's file remained closed. And, most important for me, the report that I'd written with my hand shook and fine in the company house, the kind of raw accounting men write so they can look back and not be accused of losing their way, vanished from the stacking folder. It was gone like a page blown off a desk. I'm telling you this not as a historian, but as a man with a chest full of things that won't settle. That's why I'm sitting at this table with my hands in the light, saying, I was there.
I am not telling you that the government covered it up with malicious intent, nor will I point at any living person and say, he did this. I'm telling you what 8 men walked into and how the official papers refused to keep that shape. Even after Base Command's coda of wildlife contact, the hauler kept talking. Locals passed rumors like a fever. An old hunter, whose name I knew only by nod, told me they had set traps and found them ripped open and rearranged, not emptied. He said his hounds refused to go past the first stone wall after dark. Another man, a logger who'd worked the ridges, swore that he'd seen something move against the timberline that wasn't deer, wasn't elk, but something tall and clever. He used the word clever like an insult. Those accounts made the case not of a single misfortune, but of a pattern. I held those scraps of story like tinder. When men pay attention to a place in the mountains, sometimes the mountains pay attention back. The thing we found at the mine that night was not a dumb beast. It had strategy in its strikes. It knew to avoid our weapons enough to pull us apart. It left no apology. It left us, and then it left the official record shorn as if a hand had swept the page clean. After that first night, I didn't sleep without waking to check the closet as if some terrible hand might be there. I didn't like the dark in the house anymore. Family life telescoped into moments of fragility. You return to civilian life with a hollowness that doesn't heal. People ask, years later, why didn't you talk sooner? Fear, shame, the administration's cold dismissal, these are reasons. Guilt is another. There's a particular guilty thing about the men we lost that sits like a stone in my chest. The sense that perhaps if we'd been braver, quicker, more brutal, they might be here. Survivorship is a quiet, insistent cruelty. And still, the hauler kept its shape on nights when I couldn't sleep. In the same month after we left, 2 hikers reported seeing a pale figure moving along the ridge like a man carrying something heavy. A farmer's dog went missing. The neighbors heard a sound that made the dog cry, and then nothing.
These are whispers, not proof. They are the kind of small things pile up into a quilt of suspicion. They weren't enough to reopen a closed file. They were enough to keep me awake. I tried later to find the record, not because I wanted headline respect or medals, but because I wanted the names of the men who'd gone in ink where they couldn't be argued away. I asked for a copy of the incident report we filed. The clerk at Records said she couldn't find it. She went away for hours, came back with apologies and a form that suggested the report had been logged under a different category. The sheet had a different label and different language. The details had been softened, quantified into a phrase like, possible wildlife incident, no further action warranted. My handwriting was not on it. The blue cloth we used to mark the pack was accounted for with a notation and then later listed as unidentifiable material. Men who are alive and can talk about what they remember still say the same thing in private. The language on paper did not match what our bodies had felt. You will ask me about motive. Why would anyone tidy the thing away on paper? I can offer only guesses. Maybe they thought it would cause panic in the local towns. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe a library of bureaucratic habits simply turned toward the comfortable category. Maybe someone somewhere had a file drawer where certain kinds of anomalies got turned into other. It feels to me like avoidance. The mountain is full of things that do not fit our understanding. Institutions have a habit of classifying the wrong thing to keep the world moving. I still go back in dreams. I still hear the night-thin voice of Jenkins on the radio, the way it cracked and then went. I relive the smell that burned into my throat. The images, the torn pack, the gouged trees high above us, the measurement of those impressions in the dirt, have weight. They've pushed other things aside until the landscape of my life centers on that night. And there's another thing I must say. The creature's behavior after the first strike suggested boundary awareness. It didn't ram us infinitely. It attacked in a pattern and then retreated. It seemed to mark the place. It moved like something that has territories. It used the low ground like a channel for our noise. It came for motion, and when the noise ceased, it withdrew. That tactical intelligence kept me awake more nights than the memory of men falling. An animal's bite is one thing. A hunter's craft is another. I'm old enough now to understand we were not merely prey. We were observers in its landscape, and that night someone or something decided we were intruders. We did what a small, unprepared band of soldiers can do. Tended the living, buried the dead with raps and prayers where possible, and tried to tell a story that would match the facts. We filed the forms we were told to file. We waited for assistance that didn't come in the way we wanted.
We met with men in suits who took our statements, who folded their hands and told us to consider our words carefully when speaking to civilians. We were asked, delicately, to refrain from public commentary on pending investigations. The pending investigation was a pendulum that never swung. I'm telling you this because the record matters, and because memory is the only evidence we have that cannot be redirected by clerical indifference. An official ledger can be rewritten. Flesh cannot. I keep a copy of the sketch I made that night in a shoebox under the bed. The lines are shaky. My hand trembled as I traced the prints and the gouge marks, the position of the pack. I keep it because I can't bear not to. I have found over the years that silence can become a presence as heavy as any creature in the woods. It builds up the way water fills a can until it bursts. The men who survived, we began to talk in whispers, passing scraps of what we remembered like contraband. Some of us moved away, some of us married. Life tried, as it is cruelly excellent at doing, to ask us to forget in order to function. But forgetting does not fix the fact that in 1987, American troops on a routine sweep in Appalachia encountered something that did not show up in the books. And our accounts, our evidence, exists in the way a bruise does, visible until it fades, and then there is nothing but the memory of hurt. I'm telling you now because I can no longer bear the way the quiet sits on me. If someone were to come and show me the original report with the words I'd written in my own hand, I would be satisfied in a way that I'd thought I couldn't be. If someone would say plainly that they had investigated and found an animal, I'd sleep. But no one in a position to restore that page ever did. The men I lost are not in ink. That omission is its own kind of violence. There are details still to be told. There are the specific moments in that night where the shape of things shifted, how the creature moved, how some of the men reacted, the way we tried to make a defensive perimeter and what failed. There is the matter of the marks we found the next morning, half hidden under leaf and frost, the way the prints seemed to head for the ridge before turning and circling back toward the hollow entrance. There is the story of a farmer who left a lantern burning on his porch and never saw it again after dawn. There is the scene of us in the ambulance as it emptied into the ER, faces lit by fluorescent light and pain. There is the text of a single debriefing filed under AAR that would vanish within a week. Enough for now. The rest is not for the faint of heart. What I will say is this. When the dark in those Appalachian ridges presses down, the world has a way of rearranging itself to accommodate truths it doesn't like. We tried to keep our truth in the open. The record closed. The men were buried. The files cleaned. The hollow kept its counsel. But the hollow remembers.
The trees keep their scars. The tracks do not forgive. If you follow military mysteries, I hope you'll follow this account. I am not trying to drum up sensationalism. I am asking simply that someone else hold my memory in the light for a while. After that night, when the base wrote up its official line, and the local papers filed a brief mention calling it an unidentified disturbance, a cautionary paragraph that did not match the shape of the lives altered, I started to rebuild the details in my head, not as comfort, but as armor. I began to keep notes, small things at first, times, the names of men as if by writing them I could tie them back into existence. I asked Hale for names, because he had been the keeper of order and the last person to see them as whole. He gave them to me, and they sat on a paper in a drawer for years. There is a photograph I have not shown anyone, taken by the sheriff's deputy the morning after. In it, the mine mouth yawns like a black mouth, and at its rim are long scrape marks reaching up the bark, higher than a man could reach from the ground. There is something else in the photo too, a shadow low and elongate that had no right to be there at dawn. The deputy labeled the photo, Odd Light Artifact. He pressed his lips together when he handed me the print. He did not want this to be an answer he had to live with. I wish I could say the rest of this story is easy to tell. It's not. Memory in trauma fractures and rearranges itself. There are nights I have pieces of it like quicksilver in my mouth, and there are long stretches where I cannot find the thread. But when I go back in my mind to the passage where the creature reared, and the world narrowed to the smell and the flash of teeth or talons or whatever it was, I can still feel the recoil. I can feel the weight of a man falling,
and the way the earth accepted him without question. What I have given you here is the beginning, the patrol, the discovery of tracks in the pack, the first strike, the retreat, and the paper traces that didn't match the event. There is more to this night, including what happened at our outpost later that week and the corroborating whispers in nearby hollows. There are pages of debriefs and the memory of men that I will put down because the dead cannot tell their own stories. I have been asked by a few people what I want to achieve by telling this now. I suppose at the end I want two things: to make sure the names of the men who went out that night live on record in some accessible form, and to warn that when a place sets its teeth against you, it's not a matter one should shoulder alone. Maybe the mountain will swallow these words too. Maybe they'll end up in the same pile as the report that disappeared. Maybe you will hear them and nod and put them aside as entertainment. That is your choice. I can only offer what happened the night we went into the holler and did not come back in full.
I can only say the patrol report vanished from official files. I can only say there are still prints on that road that mean something the rest of us are not equipped to name. And I can only say, with the certainty of the man who felt the cold and the smell and the weight of what it takes, that the thing that moved through that hollow was not something our categories could hold. It is late now. The house is quiet. My hands have been blackened by ink and tears more than once while I wrote. I have kept the names of the men in my head and on paper. I will tell you the names in a while, and the places where they fell. I will tell you, too, about the way our attempts to report were met with polite forms and slow file drawers. But I will not finish this here. We went back the following morning. We were armed with something different then, not the confidence of untested men, but the rage of survivors and the brittle hope of those who seek to make the record match the world. The Jeep's engine coughed as we came back toward the mine. The fog had thinned, spilling daylight like cold milk across the contours. The forest, by day, looked less like invention and more like a thing that had been waiting for the sun to make sense of it. Hale's jaw was as stiff as a wire. He drove slowly. The road seemed longer than it had the night before. The place we'd found the pack was as we left it at first glance, a bundle of torn cloth and a broken thermos. But as we got closer, something felt wrong, like the skin of a drum. The prints in the mud were clearer now. They sat like a writing of the earth, long, then short, spaced not like a man, not like a bear. Hale shut off the Jeep and we climbed out. Jenkins checked his mic like a man who was about to pray. The deputy who'd come out to assist had a camera and a frown. He pointed toward the trees where the gouge marks ran in a neat ladder up a trunk much higher than any of us could reach. "Look at this," the deputy said to Hale. "This is up, 8, 9 feet? Hale looked. He tilted his head. The deputy's breath fogged in the cool morning. "Up to the sap," he nodded. "Weird." The weird had a habit of accumulating like mold. We followed the prints farther in. They arced around and then slanted uphill toward the ridge. At one point we found a broken branch configured like a club, stripped of leaf and shaped as if to be a tool more than a casualty of weather. Something, had taken a limb and turned it into an implement. Hale picked it up with 2 fingers like it was both delicate and dangerous, turning it so the hurt angle of the break faced him. There was a scuff on one edge, a dark smear that had the dull sheen of old dried iron. "Someone used this," the deputy said. He kept his voice low.
The deputy smelled like cigarette smoke and the warmth of a man who had been assigned to believe the comfortable answer until the comfortable answer unraveled under his shoes. He photographed the club with a slow, careful patience. The camera clicked into a sequence that felt like prayer. We followed the prints up the slope. They did something that bothered me then and bothers me now. They curved as if to avoid some line in the woods, and then they came back around toward the depression where the hollow mouths into the ridge, making an almost perfect arc. Not aimless, not savage in the way a cornered animal threshes, intentional. The pattern read like a boundary drawn by thumb on a map. Halfway up a small rise, I found a scrap of cloth caught on a root, pale and torn at the edge. It matched a patch I'd seen earlier on a jacket one of the missing men had worn. The deputy bagged it with gloved hands and wrote down the time. He worked like someone who wanted to get every little piece into the ledger before the ledger could be rearranged. At the top of the rise, the prints ended abruptly, as if the thing had vanished into the air. The ground there was scuffed and smoothed in circles, like someone had sat and turned. Around that circle were small stones arranged in an imprecise ring. They looked like they had been shifted deliberately, not merely fallen. In the center was something I did not want to touch, a length of cord, crude, but knotted with a technique I recognized from a dozen camping trips. It was not an animal's doing.
A bear would not know a square knot. Whoever, whatever, had this cord had hands that knew how to tie. Hale crouched, thumb rubbing a print on the cord. Tool use, he murmured. That's the last thing that should change. There are moments when being a trained man of procedure becomes both blessing and curse. The blessing is that you collect details and don't let terror drive you into hearsay. The curse is that you become dependent on those details to prove to others what you know in your bones. We collected details until our pockets were full. Hair clippings in a fold of bark, a smear on a stone that smelled like copper and rot, a bit of leather with stitching that had been cut by something sharp and unnaturally precise. The sheriff's deputy took notes and photographs. He was solemn in a way that makes a man feel the weight of gravity even when the world tries to shrug it off. He took a video of the maw of the mine and then handed the camera to Hale, who filmed a slow pan of the gouge marks reaching higher than a man could reach from the mud. Hale's hands on that day were steady enough to lead men under fire. His voice when he narrated the footage was ragged at the edges but precise, the kind of voice trained to compress chaos into a sentence. The people who came after us wore uniforms of a different sort. Men in plain clothes and a couple of NCOs arrived with clipboards and brief manners.
They asked questions in a language that economizes sorrow. Standard procedure? Witness statements? They were professional, in the way men who have seen odd things have to be. Efficient, determined to turn wonder into paperwork. They took extra samples, soil for analysis, small swatches of fabric, clumps of hair. They even took the cord and the club and placed them in paper bags labeled with a marker that made the thing feel real. They thanked us for our cooperation in voices that implied we had done our duty by telling the truth in official channels. Those men in plain clothes were the reason we let ourselves hope for a moment that the ledger might finally match what our bodies remembered, that we had been attacked, that men had been taken, that whatever in that hollow had been using scrap lumber and rope and rising to heights in trees was not an explanation that fit a neat administrative box. What we did not know then, and what I would learn in the months to come, is how easily a ledger can be blunted by categories. The investigators left with bundles of evidence and promises. They told us they would cross-check the missing person reports, that they would sweep the ridgelines with K-9 teams and coordinate with base command for additional resources. They took our statements verbatim, each of us sitting in a small, overheated trailer while a woman with a soft voice and cold eyes clicked through a recorder and wrote down what we said. I remember watching myself speak and wanting to pin every word to the table like a specimen so it couldn't slither away. Things went small again after that, bureaucratically. There were memos that arrived in envelopes with stamps and signatures, polite delays and requests for clarification. There were days when men from our patrol were pulled aside to repeat what they'd seen, and there were nights when Hale and I sat with coffee and did nothing but stare at the table in the quiet, like men who had been given back a childhood toy to examine and found it chewed. Then the ledger changed. I know the way records disappear because I watched it happen. Jenkins' call, what we all remember as the looping, ragged transmission, was supposed to have been logged by the net. Someone at the comms desk told us later that a technical glitch produced an incomplete file. The deputy's camera had a blank in the precise frames where the shadow in the photo was most distinct. Evidence bags were moved from a locked locker to an unlocked shelf, and then inventoried as collected, condition unknown. The paper I had kept, the handwritten sketch and the list of names, were there in the drawer for a while, and then one evening not there. It is possible to imagine every bureaucratic explanation in a tidy row and pick one that seems likely and harmless and convenient, but there is a human cost in seams stitched too quickly. My life was a calendar after that. Appointments with chaplains, a counseling referral, the kind of sodium-slowed talk with an officer about adjusting to garrison life. The living men whose bodies kept the memory argued in short, sharp bursts in the mess hall with men who wanted to put the whole episode behind them, because to linger was to risk the base's public image and the homeowner's insurance in the valley. We were asked to sign non-disclosure forms, coloring the language of restraint with the vocabulary of national security and community welfare. We were not asked to keep quiet about the names of our dead. One cold morning, several weeks later, I got a call from the deputy who had been at the mine. He had his voice softened by sleep and worry. "We found something else, down by Beacon Creek," he said. The creek is a half-mile from the mine mouth, a little ribbon of water that used to run clear until the logging upstream muddied it. We found another set of prints and a scatter of bones that don't match any wildlife I know. Hale and I went back, along with one other, Diaz. We walked with a company of locals at our heels, because the sheriff deputized anyone who knew the place. The creek bank told a story in small fragments: a child's bootlaces tangled in brush,
a scrap of denim that might have been a sleeve, more of those crude knots tied with the kind of rhythm a boy learns before he learns to read. There was a place where the mud had been churned into an elliptical track, and at its center lay the remains of a small domestic animal, bits of fur, a rib that shone white in the mud. No clean bites, no easy tells. Whoever or whatever had been there had likely processed the small animal as a tool or a test, not as simple food. I remember standing over the creek and feeling as if the world had been stripped of its explanations. The locals spoke then in lower voices. An older man who had been a logger his whole life tipped his hat and said, "You don't know what that mountain keeps, son. You don't get to live here and not learn how to be afraid for the right reasons." His language was not that of a ghost story anymore. It was a manual for living with a place that retains its own logic. Back at base, the narrative diverged. Where we had seen instrumented intentions and climbing marks high up on saplings and rope tied like a human thing, the reports that circulated through the office became softer and more abstract: unidentified animal activity, or a suspicious disturbance possibly connected to illegal activity. Details were leached out as if the document itself had been rinsed. The names were there, but the causes were not. Who wished to make raw grief alphabetical? Who had the authority to decide that our dead belonged to a category that made other people comfortable? I asked, and the answers I got were a series of bureaucratic movements: chain of command, operational security, public morale.
At some point, an officer with a bureaucrat's voice told us gently that local papers had been contacted and given an editorial line to prevent panic. Panic. The word tastes small in the mouth compared to the specifics of a body and a name. The message was clear without having to be explicit. This would not be a story that made good headlines or that would catalyze outside scrutiny. We were to be quiet. We were to be grateful. We were to accept the conclusion that saved others the discomfort of our truth. That was the day a letter arrived at my address from a man with a title and a careful script. It said, essentially, "Thank you for your cooperation. The matter had been resolved. The base would be moving forward." There was no explanation for the missing men. There was no correction to the ledger I had drawn with my hand. The letter mentioned, almost as an afterthought, measures to increase patrols and public safety, as if a couple of extra flashlights could make the hollow less hungry. Hale took a leave soon after. I don't think he could stand the idea that what had happened could be condensed into a phrase. He took his vehicle and drove himself home to a place in the valley, and I suspect he read the trees and the air and heard different things at night. For my part, I went back to the way men return to work after trauma, going through the motions, the same checks and strings and daily tasks that stitch a life back into a fabric. But the fabric had holes in it now, and we were careful to avoid those holes. The deputy who had been sympathetic to us, who had handed me the photograph marked "Odd Light Artifact," he kept in touch. He called me months later with the sort of voice that halved itself between anger and exhaustion. "Someone in the courthouse says they're missing the original bag with the cord and the club," he said. He had written down chain of custody times and had a meticulous hand. "They say it's been logged as unidentified material removed by private party." "Who?" I asked. He hummed a long, unhappy sound. "No names given. Paperwork signed." He told me he'd been told not to pursue the matter further. He told me more in the silence of the line than in direct speech. "Keep your papers," he said finally. "Make copies. Keep your friends close." I kept my papers. I made copies and put them in a shoebox with the photograph, the sketch, the torn blue cloth. Those pages are the only ledger that for me has matched the world. But the shoebox is an island. Paper does not have the authority of a file in the county vault. Years passed and the hollow remained in people's imagination the way a scar remains on a face, sometimes visible, sometimes covered by beard or makeup, but always there beneath. There were other tales too, and these are the ones that get repeated in hurtful cycles. A hiker who didn't come back in the summer of '89, a set of traps found rearranged and not emptied, an unattended lantern gone by morning.
None of them, taken alone, would be evidence enough to reopen a closed ledger. Collated in a chain, they looked like a pattern, but patterns are only as persuasive as the paper that lists them. I married after that. My wife, God, she has been a blessing and a test, has known the quicks of my memory. She wakes me sometimes at night, not because of the noise, but because I whisper the names at the edge of sleep. You should say them like she'd stifle my impulse with an elbow and a laugh that is also a shield. She has been the person who reasons me back from the edge when memory tries to take the enormity of that night and turn it into a universe where I am permanently collapsed under guilt. Sometimes strangers have come to me with theories. Some offered the comfort of naturalism. It was a bear, or a rogue pack, or a man, said one. Others gave me the kinds of stories that threaded the holler to legends I didn't want to tell, tales involving old gods and subterranean things with teeth made of rock.
I listened politely to all, because at the center of that listening is a need to believe in explanations. Belief is the human desire to make chaos into a story we can live with. For my part, I have never claimed to know. I have only claimed what I could feel in my body and remember in my head. The deputy who'd handed me the photograph kept our lines open in private. He told me once, on a summer evening trimmed by crickets, that he'd taken the case up the chain and met resistance in a way that wasn't angry so much as exhausted. "You'll forgive them?" he asked, in a weird follow-up that suggested he wanted permission to be indifferent. I told him I couldn't forgive on their behalf. Forgiveness is not mine to grant. Weird lights, he mused again, as if talking to himself. Odd artifacts. We can rationalize until we're blue. In 1992, there was a small article in the regional paper about increased wildlife interaction near County Road 17. It was framed conservatively. They quoted an ecologist who suggested changes in food availability could have spurred unusual animal behavior. There was a photograph of a patrol vehicle and a pixelated image of the mine mouth. The caption read, "Authorities investigate unusual activity." There was no mention of names, no list of the dead. Names have a way of making things personal, and personal things demand accountability. Publications that flatten the personal risk complacency. As the decades rolled by, I kept a ritual of checking the records now and then. I would write a letter to the records office, and sometimes someone would be courteous enough to send me a copy file of the file. Sometimes those copy files would be the same soft, apologetic language of unidentified activity. Other times, in a way that made my chest hollow, the files would appear scribbled in different ink, as if someone had tried to edit history with a pen that could not be traced. I tried to find Jenkins' netlog myself.
Someone in comms said it was in archival storage. I went to the place they said and sat in a waiting room of chairs and vending machines. The man who pulled the boxes from the shelf apologized and said, "We're sorry, the tape is degraded." He didn't sound like a liar. He sounded like a man who had been told the story of the tape and had come to accept the story because telling the other one would have been exhausting. That is what drives men like me into speaking when we are old. Exhaustion. Not of the body, though that too, but of being careful for the sake of others who prefer their world neat. I have reached an age where time makes me less deferential to the institutional requests for silence. I have grandchildren who ask me to tell stories that are not monsters, and I tell them the stories they want. But the name of Collins still cries in me sometimes like a bell. I speak it, and my chest remembers the moment when his light went out. Lynch's laugh sits in a corner. Diaz's steadiness is the spine of my life. Jenkins, alive or dead, he was a kid who loved static and jokes. Their names are the book I keep open. In moments when I am very honest with myself, I imagine a scenario in which the ledger had matched the world. Imagine a line of type that read, plainly, at approximately 0215 hours, patrol encountered non-human aggressor exhibiting tool use and territorial behavior. 4 KIA, 4 WIA, evidence confiscated for further analysis. Imagine a different series of events afterwards, an inquiry that brought specialist teams, environmental studies, perhaps a controlled containment. Imagine the men alive and named in public, the families offered a firmer answer. Imagine other people saved by warnings given in the clear, exact words of an official record. But the ledger did not go that way. What it did instead was what led me to sit down now with a tremor in my hands and write these words. The patrol's report vanished from where I thought it would be. It was logged under something gentler, something that made our lives seem less raw. Evidence moved. The deputy's photograph was framed as a camera anomaly. The cord and the club showed up in forms as unidentifiable. Someone reclassified our disaster with enough charm to make it go away for the people who wanted to be comforted. I have, over the years, felt rage like a steady buzz under the ribs. I have been told that rage will kill me if I let it sit there long enough. So I let it be the engine for testimony. I talk because silence is not protest. It's a slow mortality that eats the memory of men. If the ledger will not speak, then I will. There were those who would have had me stop. Let sleeping hollers lie, some said, with a bland conservatism that disturbs me. Others tried to make me into a cautionary tale, veteran who imagines monsters. I have been insulted and patted and received pity. That is an odd nostalgia I don't want. I prefer the truth, even if it is ugly and inconvenient. Years later, in the early 2000s, I returned once more to the Hollow with Hale and 2 other veterans who had been there that night. We did not go in at twilight. We went just after dawn, to watch how the light shifted across the mine mouth, and to see whether the gouge marks had healed or remained like scars. The forest had not particularly forgiven us. Many would rather the ledger remain intact, because rewriting it is work. To challenge the ledger is to pull a stitched seam and see what lies beneath, and the beneath is often unruly. I think now about the families of the men we lost. They deserved more than the bureaucratic sum we were given. I think of Colin's sister, a quiet woman who wrote me a letter that ached with sorrow but contained no accusations. "We want the picture," she wrote. "Give us the picture of where he fell." She wanted proof not for litigation but for a proper grave narrative. I could not give it to her. I could only give her my memory and the copy of the sketch I had made with a hand that trembled then and trembles now. People ask why I choose this moment to speak in a public voice. Time, again. There is a particular thrift in old age. You get clearer about what you will not let the world erase. I have watched pages be shuffled into less powerful categories for decades, and my patience for that has run thin. I am tired of watching the names narrow into silence. If telling this story now can prod someone to look at a cold file, to re-examine a missing bag, to find the place in a ledger where a sentence was smoothed away, then it is worth it. If there is one thing I can say with authority after all these years, it is that the holler in question is not a place for curiosity at dusk. That is not a moralizing line. It is a factual statement based on the worst night of my life. If you hear locals warn you not to go into certain hollows after dark, believe them. Folklore is often the cultural memory of repeated misfortune. In Appalachia, those warnings are practical, not theatrical. You will notice I have been careful to call this an alleged encounter and not a historic certainty. There are things I can swear by: how the air smelled that night, the way the gouge marks rose high into the bark, the way the prints did not match a human stride. There are other things I cannot prove beyond my word and the scraps of evidence in my box. That is the painful truth of worked-over memories. The raw things do not always survive the sorting of officialdom. My final request is simple and small. If you read this and you have access to records, check them. Look at patrol logs from that county for late 1987 and the month surrounding it. See whether an incident report disappears under a different category. See whether a photograph appears to have been labeled as an artifact, when in truth it contains a shadow that might be, if we are intellectually honest, a piece of evidence. Do not take my word as gospel. Use skepticism, but direct it with rigor. There is a difference between healthy skepticism and institutional indifference. And to those who would come searching out of curiosity or thrill, don't. Do not go into that hollow at night.
Not because the worst thing you'll meet is a monster in the pulp of a legend, but because a place with a history of violence, no matter its origin, affects the living. We went there on orders. We were soldiers. That does not mean we had to be hosts to whatever is in the dark. I close this with the names I carry. They are not a litany for heroism. They are names of men who laughed and cursed and loved and wanted to come home. Private Michael Collins, Corporal Thomas Lynch, Private Aaron Briggs, Specialist Ronald Keene. These are the names I keep, spelled in my hand on a sheet that remains untouched by official sanitizing. Call them what you will. Remember them. If the ledger will not hold their truth, maybe words spoken in a quieter room will. There are nights I still wake and think I hear Jenkins' radio calling out in the thin hours. Sometimes I see in the corner of the world the smear of pale movement that was not quite a man and not quite an animal. Memory is a long shadow. I have learned to live with it like one learns to live with an old scar. Sometimes I don't notice it. Sometimes it aches in the rain. If you want to look further into records or documents like this, there are collections, declassified archives, county records, sheriff's incident ledgers, that sometimes yield surprising things. Follow up not with the expectation of revelation, but with the patience of someone who knows how history is made in small increments. A photocopy here, a notarized signature there, the odd photo that refuses to be called an artifact. You may find nothing. You may find a page that has been misfiled, and that will be a small victory. Lastly, if you have found this account compelling in any manner, and you want to hear more testimonies like it, there are channels and places that collect this kind of memory. I won't push you.
I will only say that keeping stories in the light is the opposite of erasing them. If you value that, keep searching. Keep the names alive. They erased the night for us on paper, but they did not erase the names from my head. I will say them again because speaking their names is the thing I can do that costs me little and honors them much. Michael Collins, Thomas Lynch, Aaron Briggs, Ronald Keane. If anyone can help make the paper match the bones, if anyone can help place those names in an archive where they cannot be softened into an incident, then do it. For my part, I will keep the shoebox, the photograph, and the shaky sketch. I will keep telling the story so long as I can speak. When the hollow is quiet now, and there are hollows like that seem to hold their breath, remember, this isn't just a tale to titillate. It's a testimony about the fragility of records and the sturdiness of memory. It's about men who went out one night in 1987 and came back with less than they left. It's about how official language can rearrange grief into a sentence that makes other people comfortable.
And it's about the names that insist on being spoken, even when the ledger is otherwise occupied. So say their names if you choose to. Keep their stories in your mind. Check the records if you have the stomach for it. And if you find a page that mentions a night patrol in Appalachia in 1987, if you find a line that once more reads as the lived truth rather than a softened placeholder, send a copy somewhere it can live. That is the smallest justice I ask. Thank you for listening. If you care to follow accounts like this one, reports, testimonies, and archival puzzles, there are resources and channels that collect and summarize such cases. Consider subscribing to those channels and checking the notes linked with this talk for suggested records and collections to look through. We cannot change the past, but we can keep its names in light, and sometimes light is the only safeguard left against erasure.